Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Videcka, the Dean of the School of Social Work, and it's my special pleasure to welcome you to the annual Conversations Across Social Science Disciplines program. This is an annual program, and I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the program. It's become a proud tradition of the school. This program was established by three social work professors, Professor Beth Glover Reed, who's here today. Beth, there you are. Let's give her a hand. Professor Emerita Berit Ingersoll Dayton, who's also here today. Let's give her a hand. And Professor Emerita Letha Chadia, who's not here today, but we'll give her a hand anyway. Letha, you're in our thoughts. And the financial support for the program, thank you very much, comes from the family members, colleagues, and friends of two distinguished colleagues, the late Professor Joseph Veroff and the late scholar Catherine Pavelka-Luke, our joint PhD program student. So the program really honors Professor Veroff and Catherine and the work that she was doing here at the school. The program is designed and implemented by our own PhD students. So this is a student-driven program, and I know Rita's one of the organizers. Are the other organizers of the program here today? Are there other organizers? Let's give Rita a big hand. That's a big undertaking. Thank you, Rita. So the goal of the program is to increase dialogue, to foster connections, and to bridge the social work and the social science disciplines. It is based on a program that was initially developed by the late Professor Joe Veroff. And although I never had the fortune of knowing Professor Veroff, his seminal book, I believe it was called The Inner American, was a cornerstone of my own PhD education and really influenced me in terms of thinking about mental health issues in a rigorous interdisciplinary way. Professor Veroff and Catherine Pavelka-Luke were two excellent scholars who were from different generations but shared many scholarly and personal characteristics. They both worked to create positive connections among the disciplines, took action to create change, mentored many students, and promoted balance between personal and professional life. In your program, you'll find additional information about Professor Veroff and Catherine Pavelka-Luke, and I urge you to learn more about these two great people. I'm very honored today that we have two guests from the Luke family. Virginia Luke, Catherine's mother, has joined us today, and Catherine's daughter is also here today. I want to please let us welcome the Luke family members. It's now my pleasure to introduce School of Social Welfare Professor and PhD Program Director Willie Elliott, and Willie will introduce Rita, who designed this afternoon's program. Thank you.
Two things quickly. One is I have to leave to meet with a student in 15 minutes, but I'll be back. So just so you know, I'm going to step out, but I'm coming back. It is my honor to introduce Rita. She's a second-year student. I think it speaks volume of her that she's so new to the program and yet is organizing and put together a program like this by herself. And so we should all stand in awe of her prowess and her future. She's been in my class the last 2 years, so I got to know Rita quite well, and very excited about her work and the work she's going to be doing for the next few years. We look forward to seeing you grow, develop, and see how you add to the field and make a difference. So thank you, Rita. Please come on.
So, hello everyone. So welcome to this year's Conversation Across Social Discipline, where in our case, I would just say across discipline, titled The Gift of Aging in Place, Navigating Multiple Environments to Achieve a Society for All Ages. So my name is Rita Hu. I am the moderator of this panel discussion, and I am a second-year doctoral student in the joint program in social work and developmental psychology. So aging is a very continuous process that has been affecting everyone since the day of birth. And the concept of aging in place is usually associated with physical, social, cultural, or service environment. So those environments form the place that make us feel comfortable and at home. And physical environment can include home and neighborhood design. Cultural environment can include views toward older adults and attitude toward aging. And social environment includes social relation, support provided for the aging individuals and their families. And changes or issues in any of these environments can impact people's daily routine, self-efficacy, subjective well-being, physical and mental health. Well, with the panelists from social work, mechanical engineering, and psychology, we hope to expand the definition of aging in place and explore how to achieve a society for all ages through interdisciplinary collaboration. And so Dr. Lydia Lee from School of Social Work will start us off with discussing the concept of ageism and in our cultural environment. And Dr. James Ashton Miller from Mechanical Engineering will share his work on modifying physical environment to support older adults to age in place. And lastly, Dr. Tony Antonucci from Psychology will talk about social environment through her work on the convoy model of social relations across the lifespan. And in the second part of the program, the three panelists will have an open discussion with everybody in the audience and share their experience in interdisciplinary and collaboration and probably answer any of the questions that we have. And together with the panelists and the audience here, I hope to explore how we can participate in the building of neighborhoods and community that are friendly to all generations. And before we really start the program, I really want to acknowledge, first is Joseph Vuroff and Catherine Luke Fund, which is a legacy that I'm very proud to pass down. And also my own advisor, Dr. Lydia Lee and Dr. Tony Antonucci, to support me from drafting proposal to nudging me to send out emails, setting up times and programs and introducing. And also I want to highlight Dr. James Ashton Miller for giving me a tour of his lab, which up on the North Campus, and let's hope that we can give him a tour of School of Social Work here. And also, I want to acknowledge Development and Alumni Relation Office, and especially Emma, who's back and been emailing and setting up everything, and the office really gave me the confidence of saying that this is a very professional and well-organized event, and also doctoral office for the support, and also facility and technology team that's making this event possible. So, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lydia Lee.
Good afternoon, everyone. You hear me well? It's good. Closer? Is it good? I tend to speak very loud, so I don't want to scare you off. So Rita asked me to talk about ageism and aging in place. Okay, just to confess, I have not done research on aging in place directly, so I don't really have empirical findings to share with you. What I'm going to say is just piece together some personal stories, some readings, and some thinking, really in the spirit of conversation. But before I begin what I want to say, I guess as the first presenter, I feel obligated to ask the question, kind of, what is aging in place? What does it mean? But kind of this concept, I know there's many gerontologists here, okay? If I say something incorrectly, you can interrupt me and correct me. It's a little scary because if I say to someone who doesn't know gerontology, then I can say anything. But now I cannot. The idea of aging in place actually began with the intention of reducing the cost of nursing home placement, and also responding to the preference of a vast majority of older people who prefer to age in their own home than in community. And in the beginning, that has very little to do with the quality of life of older people. And as it developed, then the idea of that, it is good for older people themselves kind of emerged. A conventional or commonly used definition of aging in place was given by CDC and also endorsed or adopted by the AARP. But if seeing this as this definition or this idea of aging in place as a societal goal, it's a tall order. It's tall order. And also, the question is that why should it be limited to older people? It is all ages, okay? So, should that be entitled to everyone? So there's one perspective of looking into aging in place as a goal, as something to strive for, and implying in it also saying that there is somewhat a static view on the place, kind of seeing a place as a place to contain the person. But another perspective is looking into both aging itself is a developmental process. The place also is changing. So Charlotte and his colleague prefer or propose to see aging in place as a process. Okay. It's an adaptation process, actually. It's involved in the ongoing negotiation, okay, between the person and the place. And the question of this is more about to what extent that this interaction between the person and the place meet the salient developmental goals of the individuals. These goals include a sense of continuity, a sense of challenge and comfort, a sense of connection, a sense of compensation and control. That are the 6 C's that they proposed. Okay, now I put this aside. It's about stories. My son graduated from college last year, and he got a job in a state. The company was in a very good city, in a city. Let's call it as the M city. The M city is quite mature, quite developed, a lot of this banking, mostly banking industry, and a lot of suburbs. Okay, so mature. It's quite well off place too. Justifiably, if he lived in that city, it's very convenient to his work. However, he chose not to live in the M city. Instead, he chose to live in the A town, which is about 30 minutes train ride to his work. And the A town, I visited it, in September, and understand why he chose the A town. It is a place of a lot of young people, a lot of bars, restaurants, full of energy. It's very vibrant. At that time, I said, oh, that's good. He lived in the A town, although it's a commute, but he will have more fun here. So he still lives in the A town. And then the other story is my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law lived in California in a big house. She raised 6 children, so the house was big. And my father-in-law died a few years ago, so she's been living alone. All the kids are gone. So there's always this call, to her, and she living alone, like to talk. This call marketing calls, and this course evolved to, one of the course was trying to tell her that she needs to remodel her kitchen, even though not seeing the kitchen yet. You know, she had the need to remodel the kitchen. After several conversations, you know, these people came to her house, okay, knocked the door, okay, and well, long story short, is after 3 times they came to the house, you know, talk with her, and then my mother-in-law said that, oh, this very nice young man, you know, talk with me, and then look at the kitchen. Really, I can use some remodeling. So she did, and she did not have enough. That's $30,000 something. She did not have enough money, and then there's some work out that she can remortgage the house to do the remodeling, and she did. And she did not tell any of her children. When she told us, well, she has remortgaged her house and all these things. So the children came together, including me, the daughter-in-law, thinking that, well, maybe it's time for grandma to move to a retirement community. Okay. And because, you know, one reason that she talked with this nice young man is just she had very few people to talk to, okay? And then they got into this situation. So I was looking for retirement home near her area, kind of talking with her about that. Okay, these two, you know, my son and my daughter-in-law, their choice or the children's thinking about, you know, where my mother-in-law should live, seemed to be, well, naturally, you know, my son chose a place that he felt is fun, you know, it's good to live. My daughter-in-law probably should, you know, time to transition to another living arrangement. However, if you think more about that, why my son thought that, you know, the MCT, which is mature, more suburb area, okay, he thought that that was boring. Okay, that's the reason he did not want to live there. And he chose A Town because it's cool. But why did he thought that it was, well, number one, why this town exists? You know, one is more kind of mature, a lot of kind of middle-aged and older people live there. Another town is a lot of young people. And by the composition of the residents there, he kind of think that one is cool and one is boring. And then, for my mother-in-law, the question is that why do we think that it is better for her to move to a retirement community? Our, you know, intention was thinking was very reasonable, quote unquote. Okay, she will have more peers there, you know, to talk to. She will be safe, okay, and she have less things to take care of, you know, maintaining the house. It's reasonable. However, those choices, do they have consequences? Well, to the individual, there's consequences, but to the society at large, there has consequences. One consequence is that it contributes to the residential segregation by age. So this study these authors used the 2010 census, okay, to do a study to examine the degree, the level of age segregation, you know, in our society, and found that at the neighborhood level, okay, the micro level, there's a high degree of age segregation. Not so much between state or between county. It's more in the neighborhood level. Okay, it's called micro level segregation. The imbalance between the older people and the younger people in his study is the older is 60 and older, younger is 20 to 34. Kind of the imbalance is represented by this called this similarity index. The index ranged from 0 to 100. Okay? 0 is perfect balance, okay? Perfect age integration, and 100 is the perfect segregation. Okay? And they found that at the neighborhood level, is 42.6%, meaning that about 43% of the population have to be moved to another block in order to achieve this integration, the age integration. And this level of age segregation is similar to the level of residential segregation between Hispanics and non-Hispanic white. And suggests that people have very few opportunities to interact with people not in their age range. Okay? So these cross-age interactions are quite limited in their immediate neighborhood. So the question is, there's variation, among in different places in terms of this age integration. But if you look at, the dark color is more age segregated, and even the white color is still age segregated. But you can see that there's a vast majority of counties in the neighborhood are age segregated, and more severe in the Great Plains area and Florida, Arizona. Okay. This is control for the proportion of older people in the place. Okay. For example, West Virginia has the same proportion of older people as Florida, close to the same. West Virginia is also an older state, okay? But their segregation level is much less. It's much more age integrated. It means that the old people and young people are more likely to live in the same neighborhood. There's, individual choice of where they live is just one small factor, actually, contributing to the age segregation. There are social forces, large social forces at work that are contributing to the age segregation. Okay. The big thing is urbanization. The growth of cities or renewal of cities have kind of making the competition for residential space more acute. Then there's age and SE socioeconomic status intersect. For those low-income older people, they were pushed to live in a neighborhood that they can afford, and for the high-income or more well-off homeowners, they continue to live in those neighborhoods that young people cannot afford to move in. Okay, that's one factor. Another big factor is I did a lot of research in rural area in China, so I observed it very kind of personally. Is that the young people move out the rural communities, living basically all older people in the community, in the rural area. So that's a big factor. Okay, does it matter? And the question is, does it matter? Does age segregation matter? Okay, recognize that, spatial proximity is foundational for face-to-face interaction, okay, and for bonds to be built. In our society, it's already a lot of age segregation because we kind of assign people's role according to their age. When you're younger, you're at school. When you are like us, middle age or working age, you're at work, in your work setting. Okay, when you are older, you retire, and then we move from this work setting. So there's already institutionally very few opportunity for people across age to interact. And this residential age segregation, neighborhood is a potential place for different age people to interact, but by this segregation, we further reduce this opportunity. Okay? And with that, not knowing cross-generation people, it fosters distrust, misunderstanding, and stereotype thinking. As well as you deprive people the opportunity to learn from those who are younger and those who are older. Well, potentially, it can lead to intergenerational conflict in terms of for their public and private resources. So these two sociologists said that the social separation of the old and young is the root of ageism. And there's a cycle of reproduction. Age segregation produces ageism, and ageism maintains the separation. Okay. So to compare ageism, a long-lasting, stable interaction within a heterogeneous age setting is essential. And this interaction, not only opportunity, I think has to have some quality in that to really kind of encourage this across age understanding and development. And this quality include duration is a quality. You have to have time, okay, to interact. And the interaction, the equality also important. You know, bringing kind of always young people serving the old, it's hard to get this equality going and may reinforce certain stereotype. Okay. Bringing old people to school, just talk about their World War II experience, all this is not going to work as well. Okay, because the interaction is too short. A cooperative project or opportunity for cooperation is help people to develop friendship, you know, to develop affection with each other. And that's probably is one way to deal with ageism. And I have only 1 minute, gosh. Okay, so there are there are some initiatives, you know, people have recognized this importance of this intergenerational settings, neighborhood. So there's initiative going on, okay, like this university-based retirement community, you know, that the retirement community near the campus, so that the residents can attend courses, learning together with young people. Also, this in the private sectors, they also have this initiative of building these multi-generational homes. You know, have the privacy, you know, intact. You know, the people can still have their privacy, but they can the different generation can live close together. Okay. So those initiatives give some hope that people recognize the problem of age segregation, or people recognize the benefit of these cross-age interactions. However, those scales are very, very small, relative to the map I show you, you know, the level of age segregation that we are experiencing. So this also scatter effort, okay, in different spots. It's not kind of responding, really addressing the large scale of age segregation, you know, in a residential setting that we are facing. So I think some policy intervention would be necessary. Okay? And I'm still thinking, you know, what do we do with that? Okay. I think there's several points I want to just raise for conversation. One is probably reconsider some of the age-based policy. Okay. It may have inadvertently discourage age integration or encourage age separation. For example, senior housing, okay, is affordable housing provided to low-income seniors. But why we want to do that? There's good reason for that, I guess. You know, it's easier to deliver service, all these things. But there has consequences. Look into housing policy for other countries. Singapore is you know, I like their aging policy a lot. I think it's a very forward-looking country in terms of aging policy. Also, their aging is in a very rapid rate. Their housing policy is to encourage generation living together or close to each other. For example, in their public housing allocation, they give priority to extended families. Okay? They also kind of encourage newlywed couples to buy house near their parents, okay, by giving them subsidy. I think they have the cultural and welfare system. We may not be able to completely adopt Singapore's policy, but there's some thinking of how we can use housing policy to encourage this age integration. Okay. Also, I think we can probably encourage the private sector to do more by giving incentive for this new housing development that build houses for different ages. You know, not every house has to be 2,000 square feet or larger. Some can be smaller for, you know, one older person or just two persons, you know, alone. Different dwelling sizes and different amenities in the housing area, you know, to encourage people, different age can live together. Okay, I'm just stop here. I'm well over past my time. And again, it's a conversation. I have to stimulate some talking in this aspect. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you for this invitation. It's actually my first ever time in this building, and I've been on campus since 1983, so I'm kind of ashamed of that, to admit that, but I'm based up on the North Campus in the engineering school, and I think as an undergraduate in engineering, I came to realize that people are much more interesting than engines. And so even though I'm in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, I'm fundamentally interested in people and interested in helping them. So some of my research is aimed at pelvic floor problems in women post-birth that cause more women to undergo surgery than for breast cancer. Those would be urinary incontinence and prolapse secondary to the birth of often the first child. And we're trying to develop ways of testing in the third trimester to see if this woman would be fine going ahead, or should someone have a C-section or some other strategy. Another area is in ACL injuries. So many of our children play sports, and we sometimes play sports. And ACL injuries are a common injury in the knee. It's a major ligament in the knee. And the problem is that half of those injuries go on to cause arthritis in the knee, no matter how they're treated. And when the first patient at Michigan, the youngest patient, is 4 years old, that's a problem, that within 10 years you have arthritis starting in the knee. So it's kind of ridiculous, and we need to do better in terms of preventing those kinds of injuries. And then a third area is falls in the elderly, and that's what I wanted to talk to or address today, because, you know, no matter how well planned one's retirement is, it can come to a screeching halt if you fall and have a serious injury. And so that's something that I'm interested in doing something about. So I'm sure Tony, who's going to come after me, may have these kinds of costs, and I know that you know that it's much more expensive to live in institutional circumstances than at home. And obviously, successful aging in place involves, first of all, safety in all of its context, physical as well as the areas one living, of course, one's health, and having security. So, and I'm sure Tony may address some of those issues more. But what I wanted to say first is that there's a lot of research on falls in the elderly. What I want to say is not every fall is a bad thing for an older person. Yet when you read the literature, it's sort of, you know, fall, keep away from me, right? And I think I'll sort of expound on that late in the next slides, but I think that unless you try and stay active and challenge yourself in one way or another, it's very easy to lose capabilities like balance and strength and range of motion. And so being able to land a fall without hurting yourself is actually a good thing, and it's something that we should strive for. And the problem is when you land a fall and you're hurt. So as we shall see. So here's a study. You can guess the country that this was done in. Sweden. It's a 2016 study of 128,000 older people, and they used something called the Downton Fracture Risk Index, which looks at the history of previous falls, the kind of medications that the individual was on, and that includes tranquilizers and benzodiazepines and those kinds of drugs. Sensory disability, whether the person had vision or hearing impairments, et cetera, cognitive disability, and walking ability in terms of unsafe gait. And they added up a score that was sort of 0 to 11 and looked at those who had a risk of 3 or over of these factors. And what they found was that if you had 3 or more of those factors, you had roughly a 43% higher risk of an injury within a given time period. And if you look at the top line, if you had 7 of the factors versus just 1 or 2, you had another 36% risk. So you can see that both hip fractures and head fractures, head injuries are an issue, particularly if you have 7 or more factors. Over there on the right, the second lowest number of 1.32 is. These data are corrected for many comorbidities that are given below the table. And the point is that, basically these factors that were on the last slide are predictive of fall risk, and not only fall risk, but fall injury risk. So here's something that came out of our lab a few years ago that is an insight that is something to take away. Basically, Daryl Thielen was a talented PhD student in the lab, and he recruited 12 young males, 12 young females, our students' ages, and 12 older males and 12 older females, my age, 70. And he had them lie on a table and look at this flash, and when the flash went off, he instructed them to push on a pedal, which doesn't move, but just to develop a force against the pedal as quickly as they could. And you can see here's a plot of time in tenths of seconds, and starting with the flash going off, the cue telling him to push, and of course there's a latency. And then you can see the healthy young males produce a lot of force here, 20% more, 25% more than the healthy young females. That's because males have larger muscles per unit body size of height and weight. And you can see that the healthy old males, like me, these are mean curves of the 12. I've left off the standard deviations just to keep things simple. Produce another 25% more than these older females here. So the point is that if you have a task, a physical task, like pushing on a brake pedal in the car that needs a lot of force, let's say this much force under the foot, you can see here I am, the older male here. Here is the older female. There's a significant delay in her reaching the amount of force that's required to do the task. And if the task needs even more strength, you can see that actually, here I am, here is the older female. She may not even be able to develop the strength. And so you could say, well, maybe she can take that into account in her activities that she's doing on a daily basis. If we think about the most common fall directions, you can see that most of these falls are forward, then to the side, and then fewer backward, and then some are unclassified. So forward falls are a big problem, and you get into a forward fall situation if you trip on something while you're walking. So we did, Daryl and another student, Laura Wojcik, recruited similar groups of men and women, as I just explained. And this is my long-suffering neighbor, who was about 80 at the time, who came in to debug the experiment, help us debug the experiment. And we said to him, Gene, we're going to put a belt around your waist, and we're going to lean you forward, and there's all kinds of instrumentation under his feet and on his body and sensors measuring muscle activity. But anyway, when he's ready, we'll let him go. And you can see he's falling forwards, and the instructions are, Gene, just take one step to recover. That's all you have to do, just take a step to recover. And let's say if you think of this as the angle of forward lean of being about 15 degrees here, you can see these are again mean curves, but he did pretty well and could recover. Then we said, okay, good job, Gene. We're going to lean you forward 20 degrees instead of 15 degrees and increase the amount of lean, and he still had to take one step to recover. And you can see here on the right is the story. Essentially, only half of the older women, and these were screened by Neil Alexander, who's a geriatrician, to be healthy older women, only half of them could actually recover from the smallest amount of lean with one step. They needed more than one step. And you can see that none of them could recover from more than a 30-degree lean. The old men were doing slightly better, and of course the young went on to be able to recover from much larger leans. And the point is that when you trip, the foot that's impeded by whatever you're tripping on is obstructed as it swings forward, and your other foot has to push hard on the ground to stop your center of mass from falling towards the ground. And so you need that quick strength that was in the last slide. And so the fact that older women, even if they're healthy, have less strength per unit body size than they need for a quick response, like I'm talking about here, is a challenge in terms of recovering from a fall. And it's really important to stay active and maintain as much muscle mass as you can as one ages. We went on to do studies. This is different kinds of forward falls here, where you sometimes when you're walking in the kitchen or whatever, you topple over, you sort of something impedes your forward progress, and you kind of topple forwards with your bottom in the air like that. And versus if you're walking forwards and you sort of fall forwards onto your hands. And these are contour plots, so this would be a low amount of energy involved in the fall. So this is a good way to fall. This will develop a lot of energy as you hit the ground, and it's going to mean a higher impact. So all of these things would be bad down here, this high plateau, if you like. Of course, you don't only fall forwards, you can fall to the side. So here's a study. It's a mathematical model. It looks like a cartoon, but actually it's a mathematical model with all the strengths and about the joints and the mass segments that are reasonably accurate. And it shows the injury risk if you fall sideways like a broomstick onto your hip. And if you instead played soccer, or if you ice skated, or if you skied when you were younger, and you learned how to fall, or if you jumped out of a plane with parachute, you learn this kind of a fall where you kind of put one knee on the ground and you roll over. You can reduce the fall risk by kind of a freestyle fall. So the way you fall matters, and that's why you can have two sisters, one with bad osteoporosis who falls in a relatively innocuous manner and breaks both wrists, but her sister who has great, let's say she has very little osteoporosis, could break her wrist in the same kind of fall just because she actually uses the wrong strategy for landing the fall. So I wanted to pass this around. So this is a little take-home message. How do you break your hip? Okay, so this is a real, oh, I'm sorry, this one is, yeah, it's real. No, it's plastic. This one's plastic. This is the real. But anyway, I've got them hooked up the right way. The way you break your hip is you fall to the side and you land on that point of bone right there, greater trochanter. It's almost a foregone conclusion. If you land on that, on concrete in these hallways, you will break your hip if you're 70 years of age. So what can you do about it? Well, when you're going down towards the ground, if you twist and land on the bottom, you're not going to hit this point, right? Or if you twist and fall towards the front and land with one hand, you'll help yourself. So you may break your wrist, but that's not as bad as breaking your hip. If you break your hip, you have a 20% chance of dying in the first year, and another 20% of not recovering disability. So that's one little take-home point that I hope I can get across. Yeah, either sit down, or use one hand to so there are sex differences in the way that when you fall forwards, we tested men and women, and because women have a higher fat body content and or fat content and have smaller muscles per unit body size, women tend to fall, when you fall forwards, they fall forwards with fairly straight arms, which is the red curve here. This is the amount of elbow flexion plotted up here. Whereas men have more muscle, and so they feel more confident at landing with slightly flexed elbows. And that has big consequences in the impact force on the wrist. And so one of the other take-home points is, as an older woman, you should be able to do one push-up a day, like maybe not a day, but maybe 3 times a week, to maintain enough strength so you can land at least with slight flexion in your elbows to reduce the impact force. So that's not something that is really pushed in yoga, or it, you know, I guess maybe down dog, you could do it with a slightly flexed elbows and sort of work up your strength doing that. But most of the exercise programs sort of stress walking, but not upper extremity strength. And so, of course, we know that it's not only about strength or range of motion, it's about cognition. And so, so here this lady is in our parking lot on North Campus. She's looking for a car. She's wondering where it is. She's got the keys in her, she's wondering, do I have my keys with me? And then there's this curb here, which she has to pay attention to. So she's got to do 2 things at once. And so some years ago, we looked at a divided attention task in the lab where we had old and young, healthy individuals walk along a walkway. There was no physical impairment, just a stripe of light, which we instructed the person, if you see the stripe of light on the next trial, just don't step on it. And actually that task in itself can actually make someone trip and fall over this stripe of light if we time the light sort of 1/10 of a second before they get to it, because they see the light and then they have to change their stride pattern, but their brain hasn't really planned for that change, and so they end up stubbing their toe onto the ground. It can actually fall. So we have a safety harness so they don't hurt themselves, but in a nursing home, having sudden changes in light or color of the flooring could be mistaken for a step. And so that actually is at risk. Here we had them actually doing a task, a cognitive task of tracking the color of a light and saying out loud what the color of a light was. And we showed that it actually reduced their ability to do this obstacle avoidance task significantly. Here, in the case of if they had a third of a second to respond, the young only had a slight loss in performance on the y-axis, but you can see the elderly drop from this second curve down to here. So doing two things at once for an older person rapidly is a challenge, and they won't do it as accurately as they used to when they were young, even if they think they can. So in terms of preventing fall-related injuries, Hippocrates noted that walking is man's best medicine, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that we need to keep active, and we need to have something that makes us, either it's social connections through the class we go to, like jazzercise, or whatever it is that gets you going, whether it's the dog, or going to the arm to challenge your balance on rough surfaces, not just walking on a smooth surface. That would be good. Learning how to avoid fall-related injuries. We actually ran a intervention in the lab with about a 3-foot thick mattress to protect our subjects, teaching them how to fall. And one woman said, "Can I come here every month to get a refresher?" But obviously our kids learn to fall, I have grandchildren, they're learning, as they learn to walk. We definitely learn how to land a forward fall when we're young. When we play soccer or ice hockey or ski, we learn how to land other falls. So having kids be active and involved is something that they can retain into their older age. And I remember a guy from the Upper Peninsula who said, whenever I know it's icy, I get down close to the ground like this, so I don't have that far fall. Be mindful. Yep, we are all in a hurry, but we got to pay attention to the cues, especially if you're losing contrast vision or acuity. How about the philosophy of doing it oneself, not getting it done? I noticed yesterday my neighbor, 92, was cleaning the gutter beside the road to make water flow, and she does have a driveway done, but she clears her pathway, and I think that's a good thing to stay active. Using aids when needed, that would be if you're diabetic and you have peripheral neuropathy, which is very common in diabetes, loss of sensation in the feet and the hands. Then one has unsteady gait on an uneven surface. And that's when you need to use a cane. You don't need a cane, say, on this kind of a floor. But if you're going across a farmyard or something where it's uneven, take the cane and don't be ashamed of it. Just use it as an aid when you need it. And then the last thing I put in, just because how many of us think that drinking 8 glasses a day is a good thing to do? I mean, it's commonly thought to be a good thing to do. It's actually crazy. All you have to do is to monitor the color of your urine, and if it's light yellow, you're drinking enough. If it's dark yellow, you're not drinking enough. It's that simple. The 8 glasses a day thing is crazy. If you have nocturia, basically it'll wake you up at night because you have to empty the bladder. Janice Miller, who was a School of Nursing PhD student, and I was her mentor, has developed this website called Confident Bladder, and it's just been rolled out. It does not have a name on, it has the Regents of the University of Michigan. It has it's produced by Larry Ahn's group, and it has a lot of useful things about urinary incontinence and dealing with it. And as you know, urinary incontinence is a major reason to be put in a nursing home. And I see I've got 0 seconds, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
I'm waiting to get taller, but it hasn't happened so far. It's a pleasure to be here, to see old friends and new. I didn't bring a hip or a bone or anything. You're just going to have to look at me. Thank you, James. That was very interesting. And I was a gymnast back in the day, so I did learn how to fall and did a lot of it. I try to do a lot less of it now. I want to begin by saying that I may be among some of you in the room who remember Joe Veroff. He was the person I worked with when I first came here in 1977. Delightful person. He'd be very pleased with this kind of event that celebrates students and engages people in a dialogue. So it's an honor to be here in that sense as well. When asked to talk about the gift of aging in place, I struggled with the 5,000 things that I would like to talk about, which might take 5,000 hours. So imagine no hip, no bone, and a 5,000-hour lecture. I figured I had to do something differently. I did make some choices about things to talk with you about. I want to talk about theoretical issues and definitional issues, the physical, cultural, and psychological issues of aging in place, its issue as a multidisciplinary and an interdisciplinary concept, and how we can achieve the outcomes and interventions that we desire. So definitionally, I urge us to think broadly about it. What is it that we mean about aging in place? Is it to stay in the same house you grew up with or you raised your children in? Many people did that, and many people consider that a goal. That is the best you can be, and you've achieved something great. But I would like to offer the fact that maybe that's not true. Maybe the times have changed. We don't need that same ideal to accomplish that same ideal for a couple of reasons. One, as already alluded to, you don't need all that space. But the other is just we have changed in many ways. We no longer, my parents' generation, their goal was to buy a house, and then they lived in that house, raised all their kids in that house, and then died in that house, or while still living, but maybe not exactly in that house. But people, first of all, own multiple houses. It's much less common for people to buy one house and live in it for their entire adult life. We now have that concept of starter houses, and then people move up, and reminds me of a TV show. But and then there is no reason that you would want to stay in that house that was the biggest house you could afford whenever that was in your life. Not only that, but people didn't live as long. So I was telling somebody, I remember when my parents paid off the mortgage of their house. It was a very proud day, but they didn't live a lot of years after that. And now we have people living a lot. People live post-retirement the same amount of time it took people to pay that mortgage off. So we're in a different place in terms of what our housing is like and what our lifespan is like. So back to the aging in place issue. Are we talking about physically staying in the same building, the same structure, the same house? And is that with or without modification? I think it's a given that if you're going to stay there till be 90, you probably need physical modification. And for that, I'm grateful for people like James who are really giving us important insights about how to do that safely. But again, that shouldn't be the goal for everybody. Is it that you want to live with the same people in the same house? So is that why you want to stay age in place? Do you want to live in the same building? Maybe not the same apartment, but the same building? Do you want to live in the same neighborhood? And then think that through. What if you are in the same neighborhood, but there are different people? The neighborhood is completely changed. What if you go to a new neighborhood, but everybody moves with you? So which is aging in place, and in which way have you accomplished your goal? So the definition isn't as simple or as obvious as it sounds. So that's physical. Then what about cultural? And by cultural, I really mean this in the broad sense. It's the neighborhood you grew up in. It's the neighborhood you love. I was this weekend at a doo-wop concert. Anybody in the room old enough to know what a doo-wop concert is? It's that music the young people don't listen to. But anyway, the guy was from the star was from Brooklyn, which I am. This is where I'm from. And he said this happened. He was telling the story about being discovered and taking the subway from Nostrand Avenue and Avenue X to the Brill Building in 49th and Broadway. And he talked about, so those are all memories for me. And then he talked about the first time he heard this song was at a luncheonette. He walked into the luncheonette. How many know what a luncheonette is? And then he walked to the back to the luncheonette, and guess what was there? I knew, a jukebox. Okay, so those are memories that, like, I don't need those memories. They're not my life now, but there was a certain warmth to it. I mean, it was just such a lovely feeling. That's what I mean when I say think about the broad cultural concept. When you go to a deli that has the kind of food that is your ethnic group or that you grew up with, when you see people who are the same religious group, the same ethnic group, those are the kinds of things that make people want to age in place. It's the cultural aspect of it. And some of it's movable and some of it's not. And then related to both the physical and the cultural is the psychological aspects of aging in place. So now people tend to live in multiple houses, and those houses change over time. And we don't consider it a step down. It's more often considered a step up. People have multiple moves in their lifetime, and it's not considered non-normative. I mean, my husband and I have lived in our same houses for 20 years at a stretch. And we turned out, we learned that we were real estate failures. One of our real estate agents said, "You are the people we hate." And I thought moving after 20 years was kind of quick. But no, they like the 4 to 5 year turnaround. So these things people are much more comfortable, and it's much more common to have multiple moves. There is the issue of security and safety, and that's physical and psychological. So James can help us with the physical, but there's also the psychological. Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? If you move to a neighborhood of a different group, do you feel less safe? If you stay in the neighborhood that you grew up in and were safe, are you still safe? And those are individual things. There's no one answer to that. I heard a story on the radio, probably NPR. Everybody in Ann Arbor talks about NPR. But it was this person who said they were talking about neighborhoods changing. And one old couple was worried because the neighborhood was changing. Somebody of a different ethnic group or race, I don't even remember the details, moved next door, and they were wondering what was that going to be like. They were a little worried. So this old guy is up on the roof clearing the gutters. At least your neighbor was smart enough to do the ones in the street. And the young guy of the family next door came and said, "Let me do that for you. You really shouldn't be up on that ladder." So they were thrilled, and the wife of the old guy, who was also an old wife, or a wife who was old, I don't know which. Anyway, she baked them cookies to thank them. So we have a major breakthrough here, where now they're not so worried about staying in the same neighborhood while the neighborhood's changing. There's accessibility. My grandmother lived down the street from the church she went to, and she was going to die in that house because she wasn't moving away from that church. But sometimes we don't grow up with that kind of experience. We grow up with the idea that your church moves with you, or you change your church or your temple or your mosque. And I already gave you the example of changing neighborhoods, but also changing needs. When you needed a good school for your 5-year-old, you don't need that 20 years later. You might need a different thing. And maybe you need walkability. Maybe you need the ability to get to a hospital or a doctor's office or a grocery in a way that you didn't need years later. And then there's the issue of changing social connections, social relations, which is what I study and is what I'm going to talk about at least today. But it's important to me, near and dear to me. That also is a part of the aging in place. Do you want to keep those relationships? And often we do, although we have other means of doing that. So this is the convoy model, which I feel I have to mention because Rita mentioned it. And this is the model that Bob Kahn, who, by the way, gave a Winkleman lecture about this model and successful aging. Bob Kahn and I developed it, and Christine Ajrouche and Kira Burdett, and also Noah Webster worked on the model over the years. we talk about, if you want to understand the kind of social convoy of the individual, you need to know the properties of the individual, the properties of the person, then you need the characteristics of their social relations, like network, support, and satisfaction, and all of those will give you some insight into, and have, I would say, going out on a limb, will have a causal association with health and well-being. This is a cross-sectional model. This is meant to be a longitudinal model. Just the fact that all of these things exist over time, and they're not stable over time. They're very infrequently stable over time. I mean, your mother's your mother, pretty much for a long time, and your kids are your kids, and your spouse, pretty long time for most people. But lots of other things, even the nature of those stable relationships change. So we need to think dynamically. Where I think the whole aging in place fits into the convoy model is right here as a situational characteristic. And we put it under situation. This worked a minute ago. You'll just have to see it yourself. And we think that the physical characteristics, the environment provides both resources and stresses. So if you live in a neighborhood where you can't get anywhere, here we go. If you live in a neighborhood where you can't get anywhere, you don't have transportation, and you can no longer drive, you're kind of stuck. And what's the good of aging in place if you're a prisoner of that place? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about multidisciplinarity, and some of this we actually, in this afternoon, we have talked about these disciplines, right? We've talked about architecture, we've talked about engineering, we've talked about housing, human services we've alluded to and in some cases talked about. I've talked about psychology, public health, social work, sociology, urban planning. All of these things need to come together to create an environment that is optimal for the aging individual. But truth of the matter is, this is optimal for everybody. It's not an aging issue. We're just talking about it in the context of aging, and of course there are special issues, but I love points that you can make about old people and then turn around and say, and it's true of young people too. And when we talk about that, the one point I didn't raise that I meant to raise was that we need to find ways to understand the multiple levels of interaction, but also to understand it as a give and a take. We're focusing on old people, but I don't want us to think about old people as only in the taking circumstance. There's a giving circumstance. As we talk about living environments, there are ways in which older people can give as well as receive. So by way of summary, I want to talk about what our outcomes and interventions are. We need to understand the multiple levels of interaction, and that is from neurons to neighborhoods, kind of a catchy phrase, but it does really capture what we're talking about. We want to take the positive aspects of the social interaction, of the social connections, and maximize them. And my favorite engineer is about to rescue me with a glass of water. Thank you, James. But we also need to minimize the negative. I didn't talk about well, I kind of hinted at the potential of negatives in the neighbor story, but there are often potential negatives in housing environments, in aging situations. Oh, I got lots of options here. Thank you. And and then we finally need to think of this as an individual issue. Sorry. This is very close to my last slide. So we need to understand individual environmental strategies that will allow us to achieve the desired outcomes. Excuse me. So finally, I want to talk about the Society for All Ages, which is a lovely phrase that the UN came up with when they had a dedicated year of the old person. And that's what we want. We do not want to isolate old people. We don't want to isolate young people. We want a society for all ages, for all the reasons that Lydia talked about, where if you separate people, you lose all the opportunity to maximize interaction and maximize and optimize the outcomes. We need a lifespan view and a life course perspective. where you came from influences where you are and where you go. It isn't a destiny kind of thing, but it helps you understand where an individual is now. So you need a dynamic perspective, and you need to be sensitive about the need to change, the need to update. You might have the perfect plan today, but tomorrow you need an update. So we need to be pioneers in aging and aging in place, and I'll leave you with that.
Now I will invite all three speakers to kind of sit up here, and we will have basically open discussion. Questions that you have regarding their talks, or any thoughts that you have, or sharing your own work, or thoughts are all welcome.
Okay. I have a question for Tony. Can you talk about the negative of like homogeneity across, like when you have like villages or age segregate? Is that called aging in place? If not, can we talk about the negatives of those that come from caring about the aging population but have some negative consequences as well? Is that? I'm coming from an architecture background. Like villages that's age segregate were kind of conceived with a nice goal in mind, but it turned to have seclusion in it, and age segregation happened, and not kind of caring about the goal of aging in place, and not age integration happened.
So, I mean, you have identifiable age segregation, but, and Lydia talked about age segregation in China, but we have it here. We have lots of kinds of segregation, and there are times when it's a good thing, and there are times when it's not so good. So, not to tell stories out of school, but I remember one time I was visiting my mom, and it was Halloween, and there was a nursery school next door, and they were all in costumes, and I said, "Mom, let's go see the kids in costumes." And my mom said, "I hate kids." So really, we don't need to be, she did not need to be in an age-integrated situation. So there, I mean, I think we want flexibility. We want the opportunity. We want people who like the engagement across ages to be able to have it. But, you know, it may be even if you like to, you need to be able to choose when to have it. But this is another one of those concepts. It's not age-specific. It works for race and religion and everything else you can think about where people come up with artificial ways to not like each other. If they have the opportunity to interact, you tend to have an improvement of relations. Now, I can think of a few people, maybe no matter how much time I had with that red-haired person, I wouldn't really like them, but, you know, generally speaking. Yes, yes, and people should have to choose. You shouldn't be mandated to like kids. You shouldn't be mandated to spend your time with old people. I mean, that's not going to work. Imagine forcing a 5-year-old to spend time with older people who they hate and don't want to spend time with. You know, that's just not going to work. But the natural occurrence, like the story I told about the gutters and the cookies, those are lovely because they just happened naturally. There was no intervention. But people, it wouldn't have happened if they were living in, you know, ethnically segregated communities.
I want to thank you for this. It was all very interesting. I thought it was a really good example of the conversations across disciplines. I have a couple of questions. For Lydia, I wasn't sure what the moral of the story was with your mother-in-law. Can you sort of, do you think that you should have been interacting as the children more often? Should you have been more proactive? What do you think she should have done? And then for our engineering guest, I was wondering, are there specific accessibility or kind of key things for redoing where you live that you think are particularly helpful and often overlooked? I'm thinking about a neighbor of mine in one of these 1960s houses who's just added an elevator because he's a good friend, because he wants to die there. And I thought, well, that's a $120,000 addition. And I think you may not be guessing what's gonna enable you to continue to live there.
I guess the story I want to say is that I am included. Those adult children thought that it's quite natural, for mother-in-law to make a transition, okay, in her where she will live, and this actually is not that natural, and in some way it's a forced choice. It's because, she's lonely, okay, and she's because by herself, then the safety is an issue. So kind of why that's happened, okay, in that situation. And then kind of make us, the children, thinking that, okay, maybe naturally, she need to move to a retirement community. And why retirement community? Okay, why this only option to choose from? I guess that's why my point is, our society has created these natural places for people of different ages, and that's not natural. That's we all kind of social force make it, and then making feel like that's our choice. Maybe that's our choice to some extent, but it's not, we don't have enough options.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Most of us don't have $120,000 to spend on an elevator in our house. So that's extraordinary. And you worry about Tony's point that maybe the neighborhood is changing around them. You know how that can happen, and you can, as you get older, you can lose all your the friends that are the same age. And there are those, including my mother-in-law, who is wonderful at making, a second set of friends, 20 years younger, to replace the ones that died, because she was just so good with people. And then she went on to a third set of friends, through the Bridge Club or whatever it was. But I think your point about making changes to the environment, there are a lot of inexpensive changes one can make. My wife forced me to put up railings on our front porch, which has 3 steps. And, we're still able to get up and down, but she says at the age of 70 she wants to hold on. But her point was, it wasn't so much about herself, but about our older guests who came, who we would have to sort of escort down. And for example, we have a those are north-facing steps, and so I put down rubber mats that if it's ice, and I don't want to use ice melter, I can just pick up the mat and flick the ice off. And so there are lots of inexpensive, railings in the bathroom and non-slip mats, and those. I think it's about being proactive and doing it before you need them, right? And sort of admitting that we need to make a change. And I think a lot of people are in denial or too busy doing other things. So, yeah, it's a good point.
I also have 2 questions. One is sort of at the policy level. I guess I would call it policy level. Are you aware of local, state, or national initiatives that would help with both housing issues, to both do intergenerational housing as well as adaptations to housing? Because a lot of people don't know about these potential adaptations, and it might take a tweak in terms of public policy and financial incentives to make some of this happen. So one is, do you know about anything or examples of these? The second is very practical. Are there courses or classes that we could encourage me and other people who are aging to take on how to fall? I've read things, and it doesn't help me to look at a 2-dimensional picture.
Yeah, there are different societies. So the Australians have a setup where you can apply for help in modifying the house to make it easier to live in as you get older. I often thought that the Norwegians, so I'm from England originally, but my mother died when I was young, and my dad remarried a Norwegian. And so as a young boy, I got to spend time in rural Norway on a farm. And there they have the main farmhouse. As you drive into the courtyard is straight in front of you, and that's the young couple that has that. And the grandparents are sort of, after they've run the farm for 50 years, live in a little house to the side of the courtyard, and they sort of act as babysitters for the grandkids. It's sort of, and then you have, on the other side of the farmyard, you have the barn and the storage houses. And so it was sort of an ideal setup for aging in place, because you had help on the farm for the older folks, and the older folks could in turn help with the babysitting and some of the chores with food preparation or whatever. So in terms of classes, you know, Janice Miller, who is the professor in the School of Nursing, who's putting together this website for urinary incontinence and sort of self-management. And by the way, it's all data-driven, based on publications that we've done over the years. So it's not just something she's come up with out of thin air. You know, it's in one trial, it's been shown to be as effective as drug in terms of improving symptoms. And I think that's, you know, that's a challenge to the rest of us. Why can't we produce something like that that's freely available, that gives the information all in one place that one would need for, like, learning to fall or learning what to avoid, or, you know, I think it's a wonderful example, and we could do much more with making the information easy to get in one place that's a trusted source. So if I have a health, or someone I know has a health condition, I go to the Mayo Health Clinic website. It's a wonderful site. I know, I trust it. And why wouldn't we do that for the University of Michigan with some of these insights that all of us have, and pooling them for the greater good?
I have a related question. It's very complex, you know, the aging process, and trying to understand how to coordinate all of the different players in terms of the medical and the psychological and the environmental. So is the training for, let's say, a gerontologist or a social work professional who is helping with the aging process interdisciplinary to cover all of these different areas that you and Tony and James and Lydia, you've all touched on, how complicated it is, an interdisciplinary approach? Is the training reflecting that now for folks who want to try to oversee this whole process and help with these transitions?
I'd say that's what's wonderful about the joint program. Because people come to the School of Social Work, they get expertise in social work, but they also get a parallel expertise in a discipline. It's not all the disciplines we mentioned, but at least they have some sense of it. And I think anybody who works in gerontology understands that it's fundamentally an interdisciplinary field, because you can't look at anything for older people in isolation.
I was just, if I could just add something to your question. Here at the University of Michigan, the health sciences schools, that's, I think, 8 schools, including social work, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, kinesiology, actually engineering participates in it as well. I might have forgotten someone, but that gives you a flavor of it. So we sponsor, or I should say the schools sponsor, an interprofessional education program. So another strategy, one person can't know all the specialized knowledge of all the different fields, but more and more services to older people are being delivered in teams. And this program is designed to really help professionals with their own unique knowledge work collaboratively and cooperatively in teams to really benefit the person's multiple needs over time. And so that's another way to think about it, not just one person embodying all of that, but really let's make professionals work more comfortably and more effectively with each other. And we're very proud of that program. And I think each year, students from each of the schools participate in interprofessional decision-making courses and interprofessional collaboration courses. And there's something like, they have one big event that brings all the students together each year, and it's something like 1,200 students a year are involved in this. So we're proud of the fact that at Michigan, we're creating structures that bring the various professions together.
A couple of questions. James, in your chart up there, it looked like living at home was a very financially reasonable thing. And my experience is that once you need help, it costs $25 an hour, 24 hours a day, which makes it extraordinarily expensive. Unless you have family will stay with you permanently. I have seen that happen in 2 different cases in my family, and I realize there's nobody in my life that's going to be able to provide that kind of service for me. So then I'm out there looking for something else, and I'm wondering, is there federal policy that is addressing this in a better way if people really want to stay? And before you answer that, I just wanted to respond to that segregated style. I'm a retired minister, and when I have gone to retirement communities, really lovely retirement communities, and I call people and say I'm coming, they so often say to me, can't you bring some of your young people with you? So there's really that longing, and as long as you're in a place like that where you could walk through the grocery store or go to the library and just be able to see children walking around, because I know they're also physically afraid of children because they move so fast. But it's the policy question about if you really wanted to stay in place once you are not physically able to handle living in that place by yourself.
I mean, if you're thinking about kind of home modification, whether there's a policy in terms of subsidizing it, not that I know. Do you know? I don't know there's no kind of subsidy for people to modify their home, so you've out of your own pocket. So there's a class difference there. People who can afford, they can do better. When people who can't, then they have fewer choices. And that's why even social workers, when we work with low-income older people, when the home is not really suitable for them to live there anymore, we'll help them to move to senior housing. Okay, but then they kind of get into this segregated setting. Living environment. But there are some nonprofits, like Generation United is an organization that has take great focus on building intergenerational communities. Okay? So every year there's this award. If you go to the Generation United website, you'll see the intergenerational program, the awards given, but they are scattered. This effort, in different small communities. They're building this intergenerational community, but small. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why I use the phrase pioneers. We have to be pioneers in the aging and housing issues. I think the reason the government is in support of aging in place is because it's cheaper. And why is it cheaper? Because it's taking advantage of all that family care you mentioned. Free family care, which, at some level is so unfair because people don't give that kind of care without it costing them. So that's a whole other issue. The other thing is we need to be creative. So there is talk about group living and intergenerational housing, but we have an enormous homeless problem in this country. We have an enormous problem of people being underhoused, if you will. And yet we have these older people who live in big houses that they can't afford to move out of. You hear a lot of people saying, yes, I have this house, but I can't afford a smaller place. because, you know, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we need to think creatively about solving multiple problems while having both parties benefit. And we haven't been doing that. We need to put our energy in that direction.
I think we have time for one more question. Bitsu?
Just a point in a statement. Camille and I were just connecting because she's involved with architecture. I teach here in the school of social work about the possibility of our social work students potentially informing an architecture course on health by design to better, to share their experiences of working with older adults that may help to inform some of these new ideas coming out of architecture about how we can address some of these challenges, some of them around mental health in particular. So I just wanted to give one example of hopefully something that might ultimately come to fruition where there's this interdisciplinary collaboration that could lead to new ideas in design that may solve some of these challenges we've talked about today. But I also was thinking back to Lydia's presentation and to what extent we kind of all ultimately want the same things, regardless of what age we are, that a place that attracts Lydia's son could also be very, very attractive to an older person, and that, we as communities, can we be doing more to think about what people need across the age spectrum that would attract all of us in ways that would enrich our lives, both because of the opportunities for connection, but also because inherent in those communities are the resources and the convenience and the, just the beauty and opportunities for high quality of life that would exist for everyone. So I really appreciate the conversation today. Thank you.
Well, that just temporarily conclude our discussion, and then I obviously hope that discussion will continue after this event and also forever, hopefully. And well, thank you everyone for coming, and let's give a round of hands to our panelists. And
Thank you.
okay,
Good job.
well, thank you.